Hello, family of the channel. Before we begin, if this story touches your heart, leave a like and tell me in the comments what country you're watching from. If you like our content, it's very important that you subscribe to the channel to help us reach more people who need to hear testimonies from people who face the greatest difficulty of their lives with Jesus Christ in their hearts. What I'm going to tell you today changed my life forever, and I need to share it because I know many of you have gone through something similar. In today's story, you'll find out how I, a simple priest, was publicly branded a thief by the very man I trusted to lead our church, all to cover up a centuries-old crime. You'll see how they cast me out, left me with nothing, and thought they had silenced the truth forever. But they forgot that God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes the most powerful weapon He gives you is the one they never see coming. The last thing I remember clearly from that night is the weight of 1,000 pairs of eyes on me, all filled with scorn. I was standing in a grand ballroom, a place of celebration, and Bishop Thomas Thorne was at the podium. His voice, usually so fatherly, boomed through the microphone, accusing me, Father Michael, of embezzling church funds. He held up fake ledgers as proof. I was 35 years old, and my life, my calling, everything I had worked for, was being destroyed right in front of me by a man I once admired. He was a master of appearances, Bishop Thorne. In his late 60s, charismatic and powerful, he was celebrated for bringing the diocese into the modern age. But I had discovered his foundation was built on a lie, a terrible sin, buried for over a century. And when I brought him the truth, naively thinking he'd want to make things right, he chose to bury me instead. Listen to my story to the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Before all this, my life was simple, but it was full. I was the priest at St. Veronica's Parish. I loved my community, baptizing newborns, counseling families through tough times, sharing in their joys and sorrows. That was my world. I believed with all my heart in the goodness of the church as an institution, a vessel for God's work. My faith in people, especially my superiors, was absolute. That was my biggest weakness, my most profound mistake. The whole nightmare started in the church archives, a dusty room full of crumbling books. I was digitizing old records to preserve them when my hand brushed against a loose panel inside the founder's original desk. Behind it was a hidden compartment. Inside, a letter sealed with wax, a confession from the 19th century. It laid out a horrible truth. The land for our beloved St. Veronica's wasn't a gift from God. It was swindled from a poor immigrant family through a wicked loan sharking scheme. My hands shook as I read it. The founder even detailed how the church's founding miracle was a complete fabrication, a stage show to attract donations and solidify its power. The architect of the cover-up, the letter said, was the direct predecessor and mentor to Bishop Thorne himself. I felt sick, but also a sense of duty. I believed our church was strong enough to face its past and atone. I believed in redemption. So, with the authenticated letter in hand, I went to see the bishop. His office was just as grand as you'd imagine, all dark wood and stained glass. He listened with a look of deep concern on his face, nodding gravely as I explained what I'd found. He praised my integrity, my courage. He told me he would handle it, that he needed to take the letter for safekeeping and ecclesiastical review. I handed it over, feeling a sense of relief, believing I had done the right thing. I was a fool. I had just handed my executioner the axe. Just days later was the big diocesan fundraising gala. It was the perfect stage for his betrayal. In front of the city's most influential people, he announced an investigation into St. Veronica's, naming me as a thief. He used my name, my reputation, to create a smokescreen for the very crime I had uncovered. As security guards grabbed my arms to escort me out, his final words echoed in the hall. It is a day of great sorrow when a shepherd betrays his own flock for personal gain. He was talking about me, but he was describing himself. The fallout was immediate and brutal. I was suspended, then defrocked. The letter of excommunication felt like a death sentence. The media had a field day, painting me as a Judas in a priest's collar. The people I had served for years, the ones whose hands I'd held in prayer, now crossed the street to avoid me. Their whispers of thief and traitor followed me everywhere I went. My life wasn't just ruined, it had been completely erased by a single, calculated lie. They took everything. My home in the rectory, my meager savings, my dignity. I was cast out with a single box of personal belongings. Humiliated and broke, I found myself adrift in the city I once called home. My faith in God remained, a tiny, flickering ember in the darkness, but my faith in the men who claimed to represent Him was shattered into a million pieces. They had turned my calling into a curse, and I was completely, utterly alone. The last thing I remember clearly from that night is the weight of 1,000 pairs of eyes on me, all filled with scorn. I was standing in a grand ballroom, a place of celebration, and Bishop Thomas Thorne was at the podium. His voice, usually so fatherly, boomed through the microphone, accusing me, Father Michael, of embezzling church funds. He held up fake ledgers as proof. I was 35 years old, and my life, my calling, everything I had worked for, was being destroyed right in front of me by a man I once admired. Listen to my story to the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? He was a master of appearances, Bishop Thorne. In his late 60s, charismatic and powerful, he was celebrated for bringing the diocese into the modern age. But I had discovered his foundation was built on a lie, a terrible sin buried for over a century. And when I brought him the truth, naively thinking he'd want to make things right, he chose to bury me instead. He used my name, my reputation, to create a smokescreen for the very crime I had uncovered, painting me as a Judas in a priest's collar to protect himself and the institution's dark secret. My blood ran cold. I stood frozen, unable to form a word of defense. The air, which moments before had been filled with laughter and the clinking of glasses, was now thick with a suffocating silence, broken only by shocked whispers. The people I had served for years, the ones whose hands I'd held in prayer, now looked at me as if I were a monster. Their faces, once familiar and warm, were now masks of disappointment and contempt. The betrayal was so sudden, so total, it felt like the floor had vanished from beneath my feet. As security guards grabbed my arms to escort me out, his final words echoed in the hall. It is a day of great sorrow when a shepherd betrays his own flock for personal gain. He was talking about me, but he was describing himself. They dragged me through the opulent room, past the stunned faces of the city's most influential people, and threw me out into a cold, dark alley. The heavy ballroom doors slammed shut, and with that sound, the life I had known was over. The lie was sealed, and I was on the outside. In that moment, leaning against the cold brick wall, the humiliation was a physical thing, a crushing weight on my chest. They took everything. My home in the rectory, my meager savings, my dignity. I was cast out with a single box of personal belongings. My faith in God remained, a tiny, flickering ember in the darkness, but my faith in the men who claimed to represent Him was shattered into a million pieces. They had turned my calling into a curse, and I was completely, utterly alone, with nothing left but a truth they thought they had buried. Before that night, my life was simple, but it was full. I wasn't born into a world of stained glass and incense. I grew up in a small house on the other side of town, the kind with a squeaky screen door and the constant smell of my mom's cooking. My dad worked at the local factory, and his hands were always rough, but his heart was gentle. They weren't powerful people, but they were good, and they taught me that faith was about how you treated the person right in front of you, not about how loudly you prayed in a pew. For a long time, I didn't think I'd end up in the church. My first love was numbers. In college, I studied accounting, and I was good at it. I loved the logic, the way everything had to balance out. I saw a kind of truth in spreadsheets and ledgers. Numbers didn't lie. I was on track to become a forensic accountant, a guy who digs through financial records to uncover fraud. I had a good job lined up with a big firm downtown. My future seemed set, a straight and logical path. But God had other plans. When my father got sick, I spent months by his bedside in the hospital. I saw how the hospital chaplains brought comfort not just to him, but to our whole family. They didn't offer easy answers or false hope. They just sat with us, in our pain, sharing the burden. For the first time, I saw a kind of balance that couldn't be found on a spreadsheet. It was a balance of the soul, a profound peace in the middle of a storm, and it changed me. After he passed, the path I had laid out for myself felt empty. Uncovering financial crime seemed so small compared to the work of healing a broken heart. The call to the priesthood started as a whisper, a quiet thought that I tried to ignore, but it grew louder, more insistent, until I couldn't deny it anymore. I told my mom I was applying to the seminary. She just smiled, a sad but proud smile, and said, "I think your father already knew." My friends thought I was crazy to give up a promising career, but I had never been more sure of anything. Seminary was where I truly felt I belonged. It was hard work, full of study and prayer and discipline, but there was a deep sense of purpose in everything we did. It was there that I first learned about Bishop Thorne. He was held up as an example of a modern church leader, strong, charismatic, and business-savvy. He was the man who had revitalized the diocese, and we all looked up to him. I saw him as a visionary, a man who could lead the church into the future without losing its soul. The day of my ordination was the proudest moment of my life. I remember the weight of the sacred vestments on my shoulders and the promises I made before God and the entire congregation. I wasn't just taking a job. I was dedicating my entire being to serving others. I felt a joy so pure and overwhelming that it brought tears to my eyes. I was finally where I was meant to be, a servant of God and His people, ready to do good in the world. My first and only assignment was St. Veronica's parish. It wasn't a grand cathedral like the one downtown. It was a humble, old brick church in a working-class neighborhood, much like the one I grew up in. The pews creaked, the organ was a little out of tune, and the roof leaked when it rained hard. But the community was the warmest, most welcoming family I had ever known. From the very first day, it felt less like an assignment and more like coming home. My days were filled with the simple, sacred rhythm of a priest's life. I baptized babies, their tiny heads wet with holy water. I counseled married couples who were struggling to hold on. I sat with the elderly and listened to their stories. I held the hands of the dying and prayed with their grieving families. It was rarely glamorous, often tiring, but it was real. I was sharing in the most important moments of people's lives, and it was a privilege I never took for granted. I made it a point to be more than just the man who gave the sermon on Sunday. I wanted to be part of the community's fabric. I helped coach the youth basketball team. We weren't very good, but we had fun. I volunteered at the local soup kitchen, serving meals alongside the same people I saw in church. I knew their names, their children's names, their struggles, and their triumphs. They weren't just my parishioners. They were my friends, my family. Looking back, my greatest weakness was my trust. I believed in the goodness of the institution with my whole heart. I saw the church as God's vessel on earth, and I trusted its leaders implicitly. I believed that men like Bishop Thorne, with their power and authority, were guided by the same simple faith that I was. I couldn't imagine that the gleaming facade of the diocese could be hiding something rotten deep within its foundations. My naivete was a shield that kept me from seeing the truth. My faith was never complicated. I didn't need grand miracles or booming voices from the heavens. I found God in the quiet moments, in the kindness of a stranger, in the laughter of a child, in the strength of a community coming together to support one of its own. I believe that God's work was done through ordinary people doing their best to be good to one another. That was the core of my belief, the anchor of my life. That's why I admired Bishop Thorne so much. I saw him as a man who understood this, but on a grander scale. He gave powerful speeches about charity, justice, and transparency. He was a pillar of the community, a man whose name was synonymous with integrity. I never once questioned his motives. To me, he was a true shepherd, guiding the entire diocesan flock with a steady and righteous hand. The thought of him being capable of deceit was simply unimaginable. I remember the week before I found that terrible letter in the archives. It was our annual parish picnic. The sun was shining, kids were running around playing games, and the air was filled with the smell of barbecue and the sound of laughter. I was in the middle of a three-legged race with a little boy named Leo, and we were losing badly, both of us laughing so hard we could barely stand. In that moment, everything was perfect. It was a picture of the simple, beautiful life that was about to be burned to the ground. Everything I was, everything I had built, was founded on the belief that truth and goodness would always prevail, especially within the walls of the church. My identity as a priest, my connection to my community, my faith in my superiors, it was all woven together by a thread of absolute trust. And when Bishop Thorne stood on that stage and told his calculated lie, he didn't just attack my name. He took that thread and used it to strangle the man I used to be. It is very important that you subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video so that YouTube will recommend this incredible story to more people. That way, you help us spread the gospel through real stories and testimonies. So please, help us in this noble cause. The excommunication letter arrived by courier. It was cold, formal, and final, feeling less like a religious document and more like a legal notice of my soul's execution. My name, Michael, was stripped of its title. I was no longer a shepherd, but a pariah, officially cast out from the only family I had known since leaving home. The diocese wax seal at the bottom of the page seemed to mock me, a symbol of an authority that had crushed me with a single, effortless lie. I was nothing to them now. I was an inconvenient memory to be erased. The press was like a pack of wolves that had scented blood. My face was plastered on the front page of the city newspaper under the headline, "The Shepherd's Betrayal." They used a photo from my ordination, a day of pure joy, and twisted it into a mask of deceit. Reporters camped outside the rectory, shouting questions I couldn't answer. Every news report repeated Thorne's lies, cementing them as truth in the public mind. My reputation wasn't just damaged, it was incinerated, leaving only the ashes of a man I no longer recognized. The hardest part was the people. The parishioners I had baptized, counseled, and prayed with now turned their backs on me. I saw Mrs. Gable, whose husband I had sat with for weeks as he passed, cross the street just to avoid my eyes. Young Mark, whose wedding I officiated just months before, saw me in the grocery store and quickly walked the other way. Their fear and disappointment were a constant, silent judgment that cut deeper than any newspaper headline ever could. I was a ghost haunting the streets of my own community. I was given 48 hours to vacate the rectory. Two stern-faced men from the diocese watched as I packed a single cardboard box with my few personal belongings, my parents, photograph, a handful of books, my worn-out Bible. They inventoried everything, as if I might steal a candlestick on my way out. Handing over the keys to the home where I had prayed, slept, and lived for years felt like surrendering the last piece of myself. The heavy oak door closed behind me with a final, booming thud, and I was officially homeless. My bank account, a joint account with a parish for small expenses, was frozen. The meager savings I had were gone, swallowed by the investigation. I was left with the $20 in my wallet. Suddenly, the world was a different place. The price of a coffee, a bus ticket, a simple sandwich. These were now serious calculations. The humiliation of being penniless was a constant, grinding weight. I had dedicated my life to helping the poor, and now I was one of them, invisible and desperate in a city that had once been my home. I found a tiny, bug-infested room to rent in the worst part of town. The window looked out onto a brick wall, and the constant wail of sirens was my new church bell. Sleep was a luxury I couldn't afford. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the water-stained ceiling, replaying Thorne's triumphant voice in my head. His words, "a day of great sorrow," echoed in the silence, a cruel joke that only I could understand. The sorrow was all mine, a suffocating blanket in the darkness of that little room. After weeks of searching, I finally found a job. It was the only one I could get without references or a background check that wouldn't lead back to the diocese. I became a janitor, working the night shift in a massive, empty office building downtown. My new uniform was a gray jumpsuit, my new tools, a mop and a bucket. I, who once held the sacred Eucharist in my hands, now spent my nights cleaning up the messes left behind by people I would never meet. The anonymity was both a comfort and a curse. One night, while cleaning the executive floor, I saw a television in a conference room playing a late-night news recap, and there he was, Bishop Thorne. He was at a charity event, smiling for the cameras, accepting a Man of the Year award for his community leadership. The newscaster praised his integrity, his swift action in, quote, cleansing the diocese of corruption. I stood there, holding a dirty rag, watching the man who destroyed my life be celebrated as a saint. The injustice was so profound it made me physically sick. I tried to reach out to the few friends I thought I had in the clergy. My calls went unanswered. My emails were met with silence. One old friend from the seminary, Father David, finally picked up. His voice was strained, fearful. He told me he couldn't be seen talking to me, that the bishop had made it clear that anyone associated with me would face consequences. "I'm sorry, Michael," he whispered before hanging up. "It's just complicated." The institution I had loved had closed ranks, leaving me to die on the outside. My faith in God was the one thing they couldn't take, but it changed. It was no longer a faith of quiet chapels and gentle hymns. It became something harder, something forged in the fire of betrayal. I stopped praying for peace and started praying for strength. I read the story of David and Goliath, of Samson, of Christ himself driving the money changers from the temple with a whip. My prayers became less about forgiveness and more about a desperate plea for justice, for a sign that God had not abandoned me completely. The loneliness was a physical ache. Days and nights bled into one another, marked only by the shift change at the office building. I ate cheap canned soup alone in my room. I walked the city streets at 3 a.m. after my shift, just to feel the presence of other people, even if they were strangers. I was surrounded by millions, yet I had never felt more isolated. I was an outcast, a modern-day leper, carrying a sin that wasn't even mine, branded by a lie I couldn't escape. Small defeats piled up, each one a fresh layer of salt in the wound. My application for a library card was denied because I had no permanent address. A shopkeeper accused me of shoplifting when I lingered too long in the warmth of his store. I was treated not just as poor, but as a criminal, as if the lies told about me had somehow seeped into my very appearance. The world now saw me exactly as Thorne had painted me, a man not to be trusted, a failure, a thief. I learned to become invisible. I kept my head down, avoided eye contact, and spoke only when necessary. The vibrant, community-focused priest was gone, replaced by a silent gray man who haunted the late-night hours. This invisibility was my shield, but it was also my prison. It protected me from the scorn of others, but it also erased the last traces of the man I used to be. I was disappearing, and I knew if I didn't do something, I would soon be gone for good. One evening, I passed by St. Veronica's. I stood across the street in the shadows, watching families arrive for the evening service. A new priest stood at the door, greeting them with a smile. It was my door, my church, my people, and I was a stranger, an exile looking in. A deep, cold anger began to smolder in my gut. It wasn't just sadness anymore, it was rage. A righteous anger that demanded to be heard, to fight back against the crushing injustice. That night, in my tiny room, I took out my old laptop. My hands trembled as I opened a file I had almost forgotten about. Before I went to see the bishop, a small voice of caution, maybe the Holy Spirit, had prompted me to take high-resolution pictures of every single page of that founder's confession. I had saved them to a secure cloud drive. I stared at the images on the screen, the damning words, the ancient script. It was the only truth I had left in a world of lies. The skills I thought I had left behind suddenly came rushing back. The years I'd spent studying forensic accounting, tracking illicit funds, and finding truth in numbers, it was all still there, dormant. I looked at the images of the letter not as a priest, but as an accountant. I saw a crime scene, a paper trail that had been cold for over a century, but was still crying out for justice. For the first time in months, I felt a flicker of something other than despair. I felt purpose. My new mission began to take shape. This wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. This was bigger. It was about exposing the rot that had festered at the heart of the diocese for generations. Thorn hadn't just wronged me. He had wronged the immigrant family whose land was stolen. He had wronged every parishioner who gave their hard-earned money based on a lie. He had wronged God by turning his house into a den of thieves, and I would be the one to clean it out. The humiliation I had endured was no longer just a source of pain. It became my fuel. Every scornful look, every whispered insult, every door slammed in my face. I gathered them all up and forged them into a resolve of steel. They had cast me into the darkness, but they had forgotten that I knew how to find things hidden in the shadows. They thought I was a broken shepherd, but they were about to meet the forensic accountant who refused to let the book stay cooked. I started small, using the public Wi-Fi at the library after my shifts. I began digging into the diocese's public financial records, tax filings, and property deeds. My old training kicked in, and I started seeing patterns, anomalies, things a normal person would overlook. The numbers didn't lie, and they were beginning to tell a story of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and a charity fund that seemed to be the bishop's personal piggy bank. The breadcrumbs were there, waiting for someone to follow them. I remembered the verse from the Gospel of Luke that had always resonated with me. For there is nothing hidden that will not be disclosed, and nothing concealed that will not be known or brought out into the open. It was no longer just a comforting piece of scripture, it was a battle plan. I wasn't seeking revenge in the worldly sense. I was seeking revelation. I would bring everything into the light, and the truth itself would be my weapon against the darkness Thorn had created. The fear that had paralyzed me for months began to recede, replaced by a cold, focused clarity. I had nothing left to lose. They had already taken my life, my name, my home. This gave me a strange kind of freedom. I was no longer bound by the rules of the institution that had betrayed me. I could operate outside their system using a different set of rules, the rules of numbers, evidence, and undeniable proof. My chains were broken, and now I was free to hunt. My janitorial job, once a symbol of my downfall, now became an asset. The office building I cleaned housed dozens of firms, including a law office that, I discovered through my research, handled some of the diocese's real estate dealings. Being invisible had its advantages. No one pays attention to the man who empties the trash. And in the trash, people often throw away their most valuable secrets. I was perfectly placed to find what they tried to hide. I thought about the Rodriguez family, the name I had seen mentioned in the old letter, the descendants of the family whose land was stolen. I wondered if they were still in the city. Finding them, if they even existed, became a critical part of my plan. Their family's story was the original sin, the foundation upon which all of Thorn's lies were built. Their testimony would be the human heart of my cold, hard data, giving a face to the century-old crime. The path ahead was dangerous. I was a disgraced, penniless ex-priest going up against one of the most powerful men in the city, a man backed by the immense resources and legal power of the church. The risk was enormous. If I failed, I wouldn't just be ruined. I could end up in prison, silenced for good. But the thought of letting Thorn win, of letting his lies stand as the final truth, was a fate far worse than any prison. There was no turning back now. So, in the dead of night, hunched over a flickering laptop screen in a room that smelled of mildew and defeat, I made a vow. I would not let them bury the truth. I would not let them bury me. They had stripped me of my collar, but they couldn't strip me of my calling. My new parish was the darkness, and my new congregation was the lost and forgotten truth. The fall was over. It was time to start climbing back into the light. Bishop Thorn made one critical mistake, the kind of mistake that arrogant men always make. He never looked at the man he was destroying. He saw a priest's collar, not the man wearing it. He saw a simple, trusting soul and assumed that was the whole story. He never bothered to ask what I was before I answered God's call. He saw me as a shepherd, and he forgot that sometimes a shepherd has to know how to fight wolves. He thought he had taken everything from me, but he missed the two things I had left: a memory card and a past life. The Holy Spirit works in ways we can't understand at the moment. The day I went to see Thorne, a small, insistent voice in my head told me to take pictures of the letter. It wasn't suspicion, not really. It was a strange feeling of caution, a nudge from God that I didn't comprehend. I used my phone, making sure each image was crystal clear, capturing the aged paper, the faded ink, the damning words. I uploaded them to a secure cloud drive and then, foolishly, I walked into the lion's den with the original, thinking the lion was a lamb. Before I entered the seminary, I had a different life planned. I was a forensic accountant, and I was good at it. I spent my days hunting for truth in the one place it can't hide: the numbers. I tracked money through shell corporations and untangled complex webs of fraud. I left that world behind because I wanted to save souls, not just balance sheets. I thought I had buried that part of myself, that cold, analytical man who trusted data more than people. Thorne's betrayal dug him right back up. My old life was my hidden resource, the one thing Thorne could never have anticipated. To him, I was just Father Michael, a man who dealt in prayer and scripture. The idea that I could read a financial statement like a detective reads a crime scene was completely alien to him. He underestimated me because he only saw the cassock. He never imagined that beneath it was a man trained to find the exact kind of rot he was hiding. His pride made him blind, and that blindness would be his undoing. That night in my tiny room, staring at the photos of the letter on my laptop, everything shifted. The priest in me saw a tragedy, a historical sin. But the accountant in me saw something else entirely. He saw evidence. He saw a paper trail. He saw the opening entry in a ledger of crime that spanned more than a century. For the first time in months, the helpless despair began to burn away, replaced by the cold, clear fire of purpose. The game wasn't over. It had just begun. My faith had been tested and burned, but it wasn't extinguished. It was reforged. I read the Gospels with new eyes, not just as stories of mercy, but as stories of justice. I saw Christ, his eyes flashing with righteous anger, breathing a whip of cords to drive the money changers from the temple. He wasn't just turning a table. He was cleansing his Father's house. I realized my mission wasn't revenge. It was a cleansing. I would be the whip of cords in the temple Thorne had defiled. My humiliating job as a janitor became my greatest strategic advantage. I was invisible, a ghost in a gray jumpsuit pushing a mop through the halls of power after everyone else had gone home. The building I cleaned housed the law firm that handled the diocese's most sensitive real estate deals. No one notices the janitor. No one thinks twice about what he sees, what he hears, or what he finds in the trash cans of the powerful. I was perfectly positioned, a spy in plain sight. It started with a shredded document I found in a partner's trash. It took me 3 nights, hunched over my small table with tweezers and tape, to piece it together. It was a memo outlining a kickback scheme, routing a charitable donation from a major corporation back to a private fund controlled by Bishop Thorne. It was the modern echo of the old crime, using the church's good name as a cover for personal greed. I now had proof of his sin, not just the sins of his predecessors. But numbers and memos felt cold. I knew that to truly expose him, I needed to give the original crime a human face. The founder's letter mentioned the family name, Rodriguez. I became obsessed with finding them. I spent my days off in the city archives and my nights online, poring over census records, baptismal certificates, and property deeds. I was hunting for ghosts, for a family that history had tried to erase, a family whose story was the key to everything. After weeks of dead ends, I found her, Ana Rodriguez. She was an elderly woman in her late 80s, living in the same working-class part of town where St. Veronica's stood. She was the last of her line. I went to her small, neat apartment, my heart pounding. I told her my story and showed her the photos of the letter on my phone. Her eyes, cloudy with age, filled with a fire I recognized. It was the fire of a long-held injustice, a pain passed down through generations. Then she gave me the final piece of the puzzle, the one thing I never dreamed still existed. From a locked wooden box, she pulled out the original fraudulent land deeds from the 19th century. Her family had kept them all these years, a bitter reminder of what was stolen. Holding the brittle paper in my hands, I felt the weight of history. I now had the confession from the thief and the proof of ownership from the victim. I had the whole story. Anna became my silent partner. She didn't have money or power, but she had something more important. The truth in her blood. Her quiet dignity and unwavering strength gave my mission a soul. This was no longer just about clearing my name. It was about restoring hers. It was about honoring her ancestors and giving them the justice they had been denied for over 100 years. We were an unlikely army, a disgraced priest, and the last daughter of a stolen legacy. While I was assembling my arsenal of truth in the shadows, Bishop Thorne was basking in the light. He was on the verge of closing the biggest real estate deal in the diocese's history, a deal that would make him a legend. He was giving interviews, accepting awards, and preaching about transparency and integrity. He probably never even thought of me anymore. If he did, he pictured me as a broken man, defeated and forgotten, scrubbing toilets for a living. He had no idea that the janitor in the gray jumpsuit was meticulously building a case that would bring his entire corrupt empire crashing down. He thought he had buried the church's oldest sin, but I had dug it up. He thought he had created a new legacy of power, but I had found the receipts for how he paid for it. He had cast me out, but in doing so he had set me free. I was no longer bound by his rules. The board was set, the pieces were in place, and judgment was coming. Before I reveal how this all came to a head, it's very important that you subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video. When you do, YouTube recommends this incredible story to more people, and you help us spread the gospel through real testimonies. So please, help us in this noble cause. The stage for Thorne's final act was set not in a church, but in the grand ballroom of the city's most luxurious hotel. He was announcing the culmination of his life's work, a massive real estate deal that would pour hundreds of millions into the diocese's accounts and his own. The room was filled with the city's elite, investors in expensive suits, politicians with fixed smiles, and a sea of reporters ready to broadcast his triumph. He was at the absolute peak of his power, a titan of faith and finance. He had no idea he was standing on a trapdoor I had spent months building. My weapon wasn't a bomb, it was an email. A single, perfectly crafted digital file I called the Shepherd's Ledger. It contained everything. The high-resolution photos of the founder's confession, scanned copies of Ana Rodriguez's original stolen land deeds, and a devastatingly simple forensic report I had written myself. The report connected the century-old crime to the modern one, tracing the hush money and kickbacks directly into Thorne's secret charity fund. It was a story of greed told in the undeniable language of numbers. And I had a mailing list of every single person in that ballroom. From Anna's small, quiet living room, we watched the press conference on an old television. The bishop stepped up to the podium, beaming, looking every bit the saint the world believed him to be. He began to speak of a new era of transparent growth, of faith guiding our community forward. Anna placed her frail, steady hand on my arm. My finger hovered over the mouse. As he paused for a sip of water, basking in the applause, I looked at Anna, nodded once, and clicked send. The truth was now in the wild. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, a single phone screen lit up in the crowd, then another, and another, like a contagion of light spreading through the room. A quiet murmur started, a low buzz that grew louder, disrupting the bishop's practiced speech. He faltered, confused by the sudden shift in the room's energy. His own phone, sitting on the podium, buzzed insistently. He glanced down, his confident smile wavering as he read the subject line, the Shepherd's Ledger. His face went pale, the color draining away as if he'd seen a ghost. A reporter from the city's main newspaper, a woman known for her sharp questions, stood up. She wasn't looking at her notes. She was looking at her phone. "Bishop," she called out, her voice cutting through the growing chaos, "can you comment on the allegations in this document regarding the fraudulent acquisition of St. Veronica's land and a kickback scheme tied to this very deal?" The room erupted. Cameras flashed, investors were on their feet shouting, and city officials were already backing away from the stage as if it were on fire. Thorne stood frozen, a statue of a man whose legacy had just turned to dust. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The carefully constructed world of lies he had built around himself had been demolished in less than 60 seconds by a single email from a man he thought he had erased. The live feed showed investors storming out, their faces masks of fury. His triumph had become his public execution, broadcast for the entire city to see. He wasn't just exposed, he was finished. Watching the chaos unfold on the screen, I felt no elation, no surge of vengeful joy. Instead, a profound quiet settled over me, a peace I hadn't felt in years. I looked at Anna. A single tear traced a line down her wrinkled cheek, but she was smiling. It was a smile of justice, a century late but finally delivered. My name was cleared, but that wasn't the victory. The victory was this quiet moment, in this humble room, where the truth had finally been set free, and a good woman's family had finally been honored. If you made it to the end of the video, comment with the phrase, "Jesus is good." And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep receiving more stories like this one.